ahead with the minutes and then come back to that. Okay, so I guess we can come back to that. So we are going to start out by looking at the minutes from last time. These aren't going to be up on the screen in front of you, but they were sent out by email in the last couple of days. And I believe there are a couple of changes that people have flagged. So we'll open the floor to any adjustments, corrections that need to be made to the minutes from our first meeting. And you can use the raise hand function, or should be able to use the raise hand function in order to let us know that you have a change to the minutes. I'm just going to leave it open for a moment, as I had heard that there were a couple of changes needed, but I don't see any hands up. Oh, there's one, Catherine Schneider.
Yeah, my name is misspelled. I sent a message to Troop T too. So yeah.
Great, we'll get that fixed. Other corrections or changes needed? Okay, so are we ready to put up a poll then to adopt the minutes from our first meeting? I see in the chat, Kirsten Bunch should be added to having been in attendance. So with those two changes, you can vote on the polling function on Zoom now. Just give a moment for folks to vote. Noted. Thank you, Cecile, in the chat. Makes sense. Okay. Do we have results from the poll? Will those just automatically pop up when someone closes it, or if someone has
it should. Whenever you're ready, I can close the poll.
I think that's a simple vote. So why don't we close the poll and go ahead and let us see the results.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Tony. So our minutes are adopted from our first meeting last week. The second item is we're going to review the ground rules that were a combination of what was presented by Cura staff at our first meeting, and then additions that were made by members of the task force. Won't read through all these again, but we'll just give a moment here, a couple of minutes for people to review them, and then we'll formally vote on whether these are ground rules that everybody can abide by. And feel free again to use the raise hand function if you want the floor. Catherine, is your hand still raised from earlier, or do you have something on this?
Sorry, it was from earlier.
No problem. Go ahead, Cecile.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I was out of town and couldn't join the first meeting, but it's nice to see all of you. I was just wondering if you had a discussion about everybody being on camera, given just reading the notes and the minutes and the importance of this and the different voices. I don't personally know everybody who's on here, and just wondering if you've talked about that as a potential ground rule.
I
would recommend it, I guess I would say.
If memory serves, it was suggested as a good thing for people to do as much as possible, but not a requirement. Does that sound like an okay approach to you, Cecile, or do you want to propose an addition? Okay, thumbs up. Any other comments, questions, changes for our task force ground rules? Okay, if you can put up the poll, we will vote on adopting our grant.
I'm sorry, Phil,
Oh,
you didn't
go right
see
ahead,
me.
Arlene.
I had my hand up. I want, regarding the ground rules, I would like to suggest that the first ground rule be amended so that so that people have to share sources or concrete information about observations of experiences, so there's clarity about the perspective being given.
Okay, I think I understand that as a general goal. Do you have suggested language for how you would change number 1 there?
I think, yeah, I think it should really be about, it, so that so people are talking from, experience, so that they're talking about, specific details instead of generalities, making, so many people said this or that. I'd like it to be very specific as to who's saying this and where that comes from. So just, sourcing where this information is coming from.
Could we, so it says currently be real and true to your experience when sharing observations of perceived experience, could we add something like with appropriate sourcing of where information came from? Would that?
Yeah, and providing specific details. I mean, more specificity than generalizations is what I'm looking for. And so, yeah, sources would be good, yes.
So in order for us to vote on this, we should just get it into a final form. So be real and true to your experience when sharing observations of perceived experience with
concrete information, sources that are, are concrete information about their observations and experience.
With concrete information. So if we add what others think, adding with concrete information to the first of the ground rules. Not hearing any objections to that. So when we go to a vote in a minute, we'll have that amended, but it won't look that way on the screen. Are there other changes or additions to the ground rules that anyone would like to suggest? If not, then Tony, if you can put up the poll. If I was right that it was Tony who was doing the polling, it looked like, that would be great.
Yes, it is. Here it comes.
Thank you. We'll just give a minute for everybody to cast their votes. Okay, why don't we close the poll and see the results? Thank you. So I believe next on our agenda, we have a review of the survey responses that came in or that we received by email in the last couple of days, but that Ed from Cura is going to kind of walk us through an overview of those survey responses. So I will turn it to Ed.
Great. Thank you very much, Philip. So as you'll recall, you were asked to fill out a short survey after the first meeting. There were 4 substantive questions that we felt were important for the group as we begin our deliberations. The first question was asked you which stakeholders need protection as we go through our deliberations over the next several weeks. And what you see in front of you is the responses. There were 87 different ideas that were produced. Of course, there were 26 of you filled out the survey, but many of you gave multiple ideas for many of the questions. And here for this question, we coded 87 different ideas in response to this question. And there were a couple of clusters, right? Many of you referred to renters in various ways, low-income renters, or all renters, or those who are housing insecure, or working class renters, et cetera. And that accounted for 44 separate responses or separate ideas. And that was about 51% of all of the ideas that we got on this question. The other large cluster of responses made reference to industry actors, either the property owners, sometimes small property owners, or developers or nonprofit groups were identified. And references to industry folks accounted for 26 of the separate ideas we got, about 30% of all of them that we received on this particular question. 11 of the ideas that we received made reference to an explicit reference to balancing the interests of different stakeholders. And that accounted for 13% of the ideas. And then there were a couple of other responses that were a little harder to categorize or cluster, and you see them on the table, or on the slide in front of you. So that was the set of responses to the first slide. And after we go through all four, we can take questions or comments, et cetera. Right now, I would entertain any questions about your understanding of this and what this means. But otherwise, I'll move on. I'm trying to look at the screen at the same time. All right. The second question that we asked was, what priorities should there be for our deliberations related to rent stabilization in St. Paul? And so there were three large clusters of answers. The largest of them had to do with different market outcomes or social outcomes. So that I think many of you felt that we needed to keep that in our minds foremost. And so you can see that in that category, the largest set of responses had to do with concerns or priorities about the housing supply and about investment, continued investment in housing. But there were other very specific kinds of concerns about what should be prioritized, having to do, I think, in the first 5 cases here, these housing supply, maintaining a variety of housing, or prices and property values, maintenance, and prioritizing addressing any unintended consequences. All of those had to do with the operation, I think, of the housing market in various ways. And then below that, you see a kind of a separate cluster having to do with affordability or the achievement and the maintenance of equity, and concerns about social stratification or economic stratification in St. Paul as well. So again, many of you concerned about the market and the social outcomes. There was another cluster of answers related to specific elements of the rent stabilization approach. So these had to do with how the program would operate and what it would look like and what kind of features it would have. And so there were a few answers related to the cap, maintaining the 3%, or wondering how the cap would work with what's called banking increases, There was a comment about the cap and its relationship to inflation. And then there were another set of responses having to do with vacancy decontrol. So 2 people felt that that was a priority moving forward. 3 of the responses were related to maintaining the integrity of the November vote, and then there were some concerns about enforcement and implementation. And then the last cluster had to do with stakeholders as well, that the priorities should be focused on the outcomes for specific stakeholders. And again, we had this property owners or developers on the one hand, or housing insecure tenants on the other, and then some concerns about balancing stakeholders. So there was 47 responses in this second question. In the third question,
Hey,
we
can I
asked-
ask a question? Sorry.
Yes.
There was one, can you go back to it? What is vacancy decontrol? What does that mean?
Yes, vacancy decontrol is a program feature where when a vacancy occurs in a unit, then the property owner has the option of increasing the rents back up to market rate. It decontrols the rent at that moment. So that's what vacancy decontrol. It's one of the features of the program that we're going to be talking a lot about in the coming weeks.
Okay, yeah. I
All
just didn't understand the term.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves with the terminology. So the third question was, what were your greatest hopes? And there were 4 clusters. There were 34 ideas that came out of this question. And the largest clusters had to do with, again, program elements that for many of you, the greatest hope was that the ballot initiative as passed would be implemented. For others, it was that investors and supply of housing and new housing would be maintained, et cetera. So you can see the answers in that first cluster. And again, this had to do with various elements of the program. The second cluster had to do with stakeholders. And again, we see the distinction that we've seen before, which is property owners or developers on the one hand, renters, and then the concern about balancing stakeholder needs. And that was one of the most common specific items identified in this question about greatest hopes. Then there was a cluster around market and social outcomes, and then a couple of responses on implementation. I have a question. Yes, Chu.
Yeah, looking at the chart, I'm a little confused. Can we clarify property owners? We're really talking about housing providers, right? I mean, if
Sorry.
My only concern is that if someone who looks this up, when they see property owners, that could be anyone. That could be a person that just owns a property in St. Paul. Should we clarify it and say housing providers? Because housing providers are very different from just a regular homeowner, a property owner that owns a home but doesn't rent them out. So I don't see housing providers anywhere in the chart, and that's, I'm just kind of wondering if we should clarify that.
Okay, all right, that's probably a good idea, and I think you're right that this term was used in the context of our deliberations, so it was those who own multifamily or rental housing, and so yes, I think we can further clarify that.
Let me jump in. So some people are putting questions in the chat and other people are using the raise hand. So I just want to go in the order that they've come in. So I'm going to call on Bill. Bill, do you want to go ahead with your question about numbers?
I just heard that the one of you said the response rate was how many people responded to the survey and how many people are on the committee. I was curious about that. And I would hope we can make that to be as high as possible so that everybody's perspective is included.
Right. There were 26 people who responded out of the 41 on the task force.
So, and taking Bill's second part of what he said there, I think from my perspective, it'd be appropriate to keep this open and adjust the results once we get responses from those who haven't had a chance to, if that's all right with the folks at Cura.
Yeah, and I would just encourage the committee members to, in future surveys like this, to just please respond to them. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you. So next is Abdiaziz and then B.
Yep. Yes, I second that. I actually like the fact that we keep this open so that more members can respond to it. But my question is, can we actually get hold of the actual questions again and then look at the actual results, the questions asked? You guys can actually blank out the names of the participants who responded to it.
Thank you, Abdiaziz. Yes, we've actually already done that. We have prepared a document for you that has all of the full answers that everyone gave to the questions. That is, and no names are associated with it. So I was going to, at the end of this section, ask you how you wanted that, maybe by email or we could post it, but we have prepared that document and you will be able to get it.
And can I just add something? You know, we're all are being asked to come on here because our ability and willingness to serve the community, that takes a responsibility and an honor. And some of us are on here because we get to put our voice and our personal needs. Some of us are doing it because we want to serve the greater good, but regardless, you've made the commitment. We can't keep going back and keeping things open because it will slow us down to make timely decisions making. If we're going on a poll that we sent out a week ago that we can't use the information because people are questioning the validity of it because the people that were supposed to fill it out didn't fill it out. So I would just ask that all of you take the responsibility to be here or not be here and do this in a timely manner so that we can move appropriately, because we're spending a lot of time on what these answers really mean instead of just looking at the numbers, which we should be able to go off of. So I know you guys are all volunteering, which we appreciate it, but if we're going to do this, we have to hold each other accountable as well.
Great.
Excuse me,
Thank you,
this
Tony.
Sorry, I just wanted to respond. I would have filled out the survey, but I did not get it. And when I got the response back, I just ran out of time. It was a couple of days before this, and I just didn't have any time to fill it out. I was waiting for it, and I didn't get it. So, because I was thinking, okay, I'm going to fill out the survey, and I did not receive it.
Okay. And then I would just add in the future, you know, we definitely apologize for anybody that didn't get the survey or timely. But if you do get information and you wonder how it came out and you were part of it, please be proactive to emailing us right away so we can fix it on the front end of it and be proactive. Again, we apologize that the emails were not sent out, and we are learning and we are trying to work together. But if you don't feel like you got information or something was missing, please be proactive in getting that. So again, it's our intention that everybody's voice is heard so that we can make decisions collaboratively.
Thanks, Tony. So the next person who'd raised a hand was B.
Yeah, so I'm noticing this trend of us trying to have a conversation on what we want to name property owners or housing providers or whatever you want to call it. And like, sure, that's a discussion we can have, but I'm noticing that it's starting to take up a lot of our time. And I'm starting to also realize that if we want to make this as accessible as possible, this being the report that we're going to be coming up with and also just our conversations, we need to just stick to one term. And I don't think that a lot of the working class people that we're trying to represent and that we're trying to bring to the table are going to understand what housing provider means, what all these other terms mean. They know what property owner is and they know what that is. I'm just trying to make sure that we make this report and our language and our discussion as accessible as possible for everyone, because not everyone is being brought to this table. And I just want to make sure that we do that. And I just don't want to waste our time continuing to have this conversation on like oh, is it going to be property owner? Is it going to be landlord? Is it going to be this? I think it should just be property owner, and we need to stick to that, because I think we're having this discussion and it's just getting to be a little bit much, and it's starting to become a little inaccessible to people who, again, aren't brought to this table. And for full transparency, this task force is already not that accessible. So we need to make sure that every discussion that we have and every point that we're trying to bring up has that point of accessibility, because we're all as involved as we can be in this process, but there are people outside of us who are not as involved and might not understand our terminology. And I think this goes true for people who are on this task force, the people who are creating the agendas, and the people who are going to be reporting on this as well. I just want to make sure that we're not creating more barriers that are already being put up by the city and by just overall other inaccessible factors that are being put into this. That's all I really have to say. I just want to make sure that we're not trying to complicate something that is not complicated.
Thanks, B. And there's a suggestion that Ed from Kira put in the chat about rental property owner, and some responses to that as a term that we might use, but appreciate what you've shared, B. I don't think I've seen other hands up. And maybe if people have thoughts about Ed's suggestion there, you can continue to respond in the chat. Ed, do you want to go back to your slides?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. This is great input. All right, so I talked about the third one, which is greatest hopes. And then the next question we asked you was greatest concerns. Here there were 48 separate ideas. And actually that in itself is something that's interesting, right? 26 of you answered the survey and provided 34 ideas about greatest hopes, 48 different ideas about greatest concerns. I think this speaks to, you know, where you're coming from at the beginning of this process, where your concerns might be, I think, dominating here. It's about 50% more concerns than there were hopes, and I just think that might be informative in and of itself. The clusters here about greatest concerns, the largest cluster was about outcomes again. What would happen as a result of the rent stabilization? But again, it's about what would happen in the marketplace, but also what would happen to tenants in terms of rents and affordability. So there were both of these concerns, but having to do again with outcomes. Another cluster related to stakeholders, and then a third related to program elements. It seems that these were the organizing ideas that were going through your heads as you were answering these questions. And then again, a smaller cluster having to do with implementation. Here there was one single category of response that showed up several times, and that was a variation on the concern that rental property owners and or developers might have an outsized influence on the outcome of these proceedings. But here then is the summary of the greatest concerns. So those are the 4 questions that we have, and we can take any additional questions that you have or comments at this point. Phil.
Seen any hands raised, but that might be because I'm not looking at it right. Anyone have any additional questions for Ed? And my understanding from Abdiaziz's question and your response is that you'll be sending out the full results. I guess you were asking what's the best way to do that. Seems to me like email is probably simplest, but what other folks think? Any alternative suggestions? If not, then that'll come out and it sounds like de-identified, but the full survey responses.
Right, and you'll be able to see that of course the full responses are much richer. We have organized them and simplified these responses just to get them into categories. So
Great, thank you. Question from Cecile.
I'm not very adept at using Box, nor do I know how prolifically it's used. I'm just wondering that there might be a lot of this kinds of things over the time of our work, and whether or not it'd be convenient for people if everything we got was in a box, so we don't have to rifle through hundreds of emails to try to find something. Don't know if you thought about that.
Cecile, we've thought of that, and that was, I think, the main alternative to email. And so I think you're probably right that as we go through the weeks of this, that there may be more and more of these kind of documents that we could just drop into a location that everyone on the task force would have access to. And so that's probably going to be an outcome as well.
Sounds great. Other comments or questions on the survey?
So I have a question. I don't know if you saw my hand raised.
I didn't. Go ahead, Arlene.
Okay, yeah, something must be wrong with my reactions. Anyway, I was wondering, for those of us who didn't have the opportunity to fill out the survey, if we did that between now and the next meeting, would this table then be revised to reflect the additional responses? If there are 20, how many did you say, 26 of us who didn't respond?
Right. No, 26 did respond out of 41.
Okay.
So I think, given that this was our first go through, that we could keep it open for a few days and give people the opportunity to respond to this, and then add those responses. But I do think going forward, that if we can make sure everyone completes the surveys in the week that we have it up, then we'll move forward that way too.
Oh, and I agree, and I appreciate that, and I will try and get mine response within the next couple of days, as everyone who didn't should. As like I said, I did not receive the survey right away. I did then send in a note to say that I didn't receive it, and I was told that it was already closed. So, but I will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. And there's a question from Cecile. Who did the email come from? I believe it was from Tripty. Is that right?
I think so.
So if you did not receive the survey in an email from Tripty, then please contact either the Cura staff or one of the co-chairs so that we can just make sure that everybody's getting the information in real time.
And this is Tripty. I'm just going to say, from a communication standpoint, what I'm looking to do is send out an email today. After the meeting, you'll probably see it by 5 o'clock today. That'll have a new link. So if you don't receive the link today, and it'll have a link for last week's survey as well as this week's survey. And so that'll go out on Tuesdays. We hope to get responses actually, and despite this is a tight turnaround, by Thursday at noon. That's so that I can compile the results for our team to review on Friday. And then we can, at Friday, send out a packet to you guys that also includes the meeting minutes, survey results, responses, etc., all in one. So we want to get communications out Tuesday and Friday.
Thanks, Tripty. I see Terrence has his hand up.
Yeah, and I just kind of wanted to comment sort of on the context of this survey, right? The usefulness of this particular survey is to all of you, right? It's for you to know who's in the room, the interest that's in this group, that to carry forward in the group. So of course, yeah, different surveys will have different intentionalities behind them, but this survey is for y'all, right? To understand who's in the room. And as we carry forward, as we get closer to those small groups in the future, I think it helps us sort of think about what those groups might be. Those might change, of course, over the next couple of weeks. But right, your responses are important to get in this particular survey in that context. And so I just wanted to share that to help y'all understand the usefulness of it in this way.
Thank you. Just gonna do one more check here. Any other questions or comments before we move into the kind of content parts of our agenda for today? Okay, so, I see a hand from Jay.
Yeah, I don't know where this belongs in this meeting, but at some point I want to revisit the discussion we had last week about our charge. One of the things that we we're told by the mayor is that he's not interested in our input on the ordinance that he proposed to the council last week regarding the whether the cap should apply to new construction. And maybe Councilmember Tolbert can help us with that. So I want to revisit. I don't have a particular opinion as to whether the cap should or shouldn't apply, but it seems to me that that's a pretty important piece of this, and I just think that we should revisit that. I mean, it seems to me our charge, we were certainly, my understanding, we were appointed by the mayor, but he's not the only stakeholder. The stakeholders is all these folks we've talked about, and of course the city council as well. So I think it's important to at least decide whether or not we should have input into the ordinance that was proposed last week.
So I'm going to move us into the next part of the agenda. I just want to briefly respond to that, and we can come back to it at the end of our meeting today. My co-chair, Tony, was, I think, speaking to this at the beginning of the meeting. Any concerns, proposals, any of us as residents and citizens of St. Paul that we have for the city council and the mayor, we can take to the city council and the mayor. This task force has been given a charge by the mayor. He laid that out at the first meeting. If in conversations that happen with the mayor, the city council, and other stakeholders, including many people who are here, if there's some change to that, then of course we can adjust what we do as a task force. But as Tony said at the start of the meeting, we're going to stick to the charge that we've been given. And if there's some change to that, then we can adjust. I also think it's important, the point that C. Terrence made in our discussion last time, that Councilmember Tolbert is here as a council member, as an expert on these issues, as a resident, but not as a representative of all of the members of the council.
Yeah, let me just, I don't want to drag this, but I guess the question is, who is our constituency? I believe our constituency is the entire city, not just the mayor. Obviously, he's an important part of this, but if this group decides, in fact, to take a position on the cap, the ordinance cap that was proposed, do we have the opportunity, do we have the right as a group to make that decision to say, we believe our charge should be expanded? I'm not sure what prevents us from doing that. If this group decides it's an important component of what we're looking at, what would prevent us from doing that?
Well, because what I think is, we're put in place to look for a long-term solution. If we start to look at short-term fixes, it will take us off course. And if we really are going to work on an ordinance that got introduced last week, then all of our work right now would not be talking about anything else, but strictly about that ordinance because it's time sensitive. And that would throw us off. I think that there's other venues, and the fact that a new ordinance was brought about, there is different groups to bring that stuff up. And they do want to hear voices, and that's why there's different people working on that particular issue. Ours is not, we cannot, I don't believe as a group, come up with a solution in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because we have given ourselves, in order for this group to make an informed decision, we've given ourselves 3 to 4 weeks of just having an educational process where we're just listening. Now we would have to throw out that process and dive really deep into this new thing that got introduced last week, if that's what if that was gonna be our responsibility. I will say that there's different council members and the mayor and other people, and I don't think the mayor is against discussing that. He just doesn't want this group to be worried about that because it'll throw us off of track.
But it seems to me that's such an important piece of this that I don't think it's a short-term solution. I think it's a long-term solution. The ordinance can't be implemented till November anyway. So it's not like the council has to act on it the next few weeks. It can't take effect till November. So it just seems to me, again, I'll throw it out to the group. If this group decides that's an important piece of this, what we're studying, can we do that? I mean, what's to prevent us from saying we believe our charge is wider than this? We're 41 pretty competent people here, so why not expand it if we feel the need?
I'll just answer you. I believe our charge is to come up with recommendations. I believe that the time thing and where we spend our energy is the misconception. I think right now, because people are talking about that ordinance now. And so I think the work to be done with that ordinance is happening right now. So it's more of a timing thing. I think through our process, right, if we deal with this very thing that you're talking about in 3 months from now, or in 10 weeks, will decisions already be made? I think we're okay as a group to come up with recommendations, how we feel, but I don't think that we can get distracted from our process to deal with what's happening right now. So
I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll let sleeping dogs lie. If this group makes a decision that that's important, I assume we could do that. There's nothing in ordinance or statute or anywhere else that would prevent us from looking at that. It seems to me that the timing issue seems to be driving an important policy consideration. So I would leave it to the group to decide if someone wants to make a motion at some point to study that. I would presume that we could, in fact, do that.
So I'm going to jump in here. A number of people have weighed in the chat. There's also hands up. And as some people in the chat have said, we're almost an hour into our meeting. We have a lot of content we want to cover. And I just want to reiterate the question and suggestions that you're raising, Jay, are perfectly reasonable and are things that should be raised with members of the council and or with the mayor. We are currently operating according to the charge that we've been given by the mayor. And, folks are welcome to have those conversations. And if there's changes, we'll adjust. For now, this is the group that we have. This is the agenda that we have, and we don't want to spend the rest of our 2-hour meeting today on a question of changing our charge. So I know that there's other folks who have their hands up, but I think it would be better for us, as some people have been suggesting in the chat, to move into the content. But I'll just hold it open for a second and see, is there anyone who feels like kind of a burning need to speak on this before we move on? Great, thank you. So I will, go ahead.
Yes, I guess when I joined this group, I understood what our charge was, that our charge was going to be limited to sort of the non-new development. I think that was clear from when I got called by the mayor's staff, and I think it was clear from the mayor. I do say that we, it's possible, but I guess I will say that should the current ordinance has been proposed to the city council pass, that will at least color or affect my decisions or positions for this group. So I guess I want to sort of reiterate, I'm not completely disagreeing with other comments, but I would say that I still believe that we can do our charge, but we have to recognize that this is a whole aspect to this thing, right? So one does affect another. So that's all.
Thank you, Richard. Great. So I'm going to turn it to Ed, who is going to be doing most of the content. As I understand, we're going to be talking about history of rent stabilization in different cities. We'll be breaking into small groups on that, and then we'll be talking about different approaches to caps and also small group discussion on this. Ed.
Great, thank you, Philip. And we'll try to get through as much of this as we can. And we've got weeks, ahead of us. So if we don't get through everything today, we can pick up what we don't get to next week, as we'll just move on. So, rent control was first enacted in 1920 in the United States. It was really a wartime kind of emergency effort. It was a response to what people and newspapers were calling rent profiteering at the time, which was simply rapidly escalating rental prices during the scarcity of World War I. And it was seen from the beginning as very much of just an emergency kind of action, that this was a response to a very peculiar and particular set of circumstances, politically and economically. And in fact, most of the courts in the United States in the first part of the 20th century actually required that there be some kind of an emergency in place in order to have found rent control constitutional. So the courts felt that it was a legal requirement. And most politicians felt it was a political requirement for instituting rent control. And that this was made clear by the Supreme Court in the 1920s in several different cases. But what those cases did also establish was that rent control was constitutional under these circumstances. The First World War rent controls were terminated in the early 1920s, virtually everywhere in the United States, except for New York and New York City, most prominently. And that's because New York was able to establish that it was still in the middle of a housing crisis. And in fact, they made reference to the fact that there was over 100,000 renters or renter households in New York who were facing imminent dispossession and eviction because of the increases in rents that were taking place. And so, in fact, New York enacted their own separate program of rent control in 1920, and that continued to operate. I will say that other places after World War I, when rent control was eliminated, many cities established what are called fair rent committees, which existed to arbitrate disputes between landlords and tenants. They didn't set any controls on the rents, but they were in place in order to assess these disputes. So World War II saw a reenactment of rent control. And this was, in fact, the first time that it became really used on a full national scale. And again, this was a reaction to the housing shortage during the war and the inflation in rents. And you can see in this flyer a reference to OPA, and that is the Office of Price Adjustment, which was created by the 1942 Emergency Price Control Act. And this was, and each region had its own OPA office that would essentially implement these rent control freezes that were put in place by this act of Congress. And Congress also enacted a special rent control for Washington, D.C., because it was, in fact, experiencing extreme increases in rents during the wartime as well. At its peak, right during and after the war, federal rent controls covered areas where 93 million people lived. That was in 1949, 2/3 of the American population. But after the war, rent controls were eliminated in many of those places, so that by the end of the 1940s, rent controls covered areas where only 20 million people lived, only 13% of the population. But it was the rent controls of the first two world wars were really quite different from what exists now. And this is called the first generation of rent controls. These rent controls set absolute ceilings on rents. They actually froze rents at certain levels and imposed these very strict limits to what landlords or what renters had to pay and what property owners could charge. And in the earliest iterations of rent control, this applied to all rentals. It wasn't until 1949 that Congress exempted new construction. But these World War II rent controls were actually extended into the 1950s for two reasons. One, there was a severe housing shortage coming out of the Second World War, remember that what preceded the Second World War was 12 or 13 years of depression, of the Great Depression, where there wasn't much construction being done anyway. So you had 15 to almost 20 years of very limited housing construction. Catherine, do you have a question?
Yeah, so when you say that, the absolute ceiling on rents was it was a dollar amount, and so then when they exempted new construction, they were saying you can charge whatever rent you want. You can go above our set rate, right?
That's correct.
As opposed to a percentage.
That's correct. That's correct. Okay. They completely exempted new construction, right? Okay. So again, because of the post-war housing shortage, and then the Korean War and the inflation and shortages associated with that, rent control was extended beyond World War II. But really by 1954, it was gone from most places, again, except for New York. New York State and New York City retained their rent controls over this period of time, and in fact, from 1950s onward. So, but the first generation of rent control was emergency, wartime, and constituted very hard ceilings on rents. No allowable rents above a certain frozen ceiling amount. So from that, we move into what a lot of people call the second generation of rent regulation. And this resulted from a resurgence of local controls that and state controls that began in the late 1960s. And I think you might also attribute those to the inflation and the Vietnam War conditions that were limiting the market at that time. So in 1969, New York City passed a new law. Boston, Massachusetts, and Miami, Florida also enacted laws in 1969. The Boston and Miami laws were almost immediately struck down by the courts. The Boston law was struck down by the courts because the court decided that the state of Massachusetts had not given Boston the authority to create its own rent control. So shortly after that legal decision by the courts, the Massachusetts state legislature enacted enabling legislation, which essentially and very clearly said Boston and other cities with populations over 50,000 could in fact enact rent control. And so that's what the Massachusetts legislation did in 1970. And then in 1971, President Nixon imposed a series of wage and price freezes. They were supposed to be 90 days in length, but they were extended and in fact lasted for about 15 or 16 months. Tram, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Real quick, you said, can you correct me if I heard this wrong? You said that rent controls were implemented again, partially because of the Vietnam War and inflation?
Yes.
Okay, so it was meant to support people who were dealing with, supposedly the government was trying to help people whose housing costs were rising due to inflation.
Right, that's correct. And that made it similar actually to the first generation of rent stabilization, which were in fact reactions to housing crises, right?
Thank you.
Okay. So while you had this renewed interest at the local level, you had Richard Nixon imposing wage and price freezes, which included a hard cap on rents. So this was a nationwide hard cap on rents that he imposed because he was given those powers through the Economic Stabilization Act in 1970. And as we note here, it was extended through January of 1973. And so this also did a lot to expand the idea of rent stabilization beyond the few places that had been looking at it, most of those places on the West Coast. And so immediately then after, for example, in Massachusetts, after the state legislature enacted that enabling legislation, Boston and several other cities reenacted rent control, and in the early 1970s. And so you had that activity taking place in Massachusetts. In New Jersey, you had a quick spreading of rent stabilization, mainly resulting from statewide tenant organizations advocating fairly successfully around the state. And by 1976, in the middle of the 1970s, close to 100 communities in New Jersey had some form of rent stabilization in place. In California, the city of Berkeley enacted a law by voter initiative in 1972. The city of San Francisco passed a law in 1979. And by the early 1980s, there were 10 different communities across California that had rent control. And there had been, in fact, several more cities that had considered rent control, but had decided against it. And then finally, you had state and local legislation in the state of New York. Again, the New York legislation was fairly constant from the 1920s on, but you had new legislation for New York City as well. But in addition to these places, this is where most of the action was occurring in that second generation. Cecile, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Just a clarification. When you said Nixon, his action, did it put a cap on rents? Did it put a cap on amounts of rent increases? I just want a clarification.
Yeah, it was a hard freeze like the
Just
earlier.
no increases. Okay,
Right,
thanks.
it was a freeze on rents.
Thank you.
Sure. So at the same time that these four cities were really getting quite heavily into rent stabilization, the state of Maryland passed a law which allowed statewide rent control. The state of Maine adopted a rent control authorization law in 1973. Theirs was an enabling act, so it didn't create rent control, but it allowed the cities of Maine to adopt it if they wanted to. The Alaska legislature in 1974 allowed its administrative branch to create local rent controls for emergency situations. And Congress enacted rent control for the District of Columbia in 1973, or at least it authorized it for the District of Columbia in 1973. And the following year, the council for the district enacted that legislation. Rent control was introduced in Hawaii. It was introduced in Wisconsin, in other parts of Michigan, but these were defeated. Some never got off the ground, et cetera. But the idea was that the early 1970s was a time of significant increase. Most commonly, the rationale for this generation of rent controls was a housing shortage, excessive rent increases, et cetera. And the features of this second generation of rent controls, they were quite different than that first generation of hard freezes. In fact, it was so different that people called this moderate rent control, or some use the term rent stabilization to differentiate it from the hard rent controls of the earlier generation. And what these programs allowed, in fact, are the kinds of features that we're going to be talking about over the next several weeks. First of all, they didn't put hard freezes on rents. They instead allowed rent increases, but limited them through different caps on the rents. Sometimes these caps were determined by the rent boards that had been created locally. Sometimes they were set at specific percentages, and sometimes they were set to match the rate of inflation in one way or another. But rent caps rather than rent freezes is one big distinction. The second distinction is that this generation of rent controls included exemptions for portions of the housing stock. And again, I think the most common exemption that was used was an exemption for new construction, but there were also exemptions for rentals in small buildings or rentals in properties that were owner occupied as well, duplexes or triplexes or fourplexes. So this generation of rent controls incorporated exemptions. In addition to that, they tended to incorporate provisions for the pass-through of specific costs from the property owner to the tenant. And so sometimes this was for property taxes, sometimes for capital improvements, or what we will call and talk about as fair return provisions. That is some kind of provision that allowed landlords to get a fair return on their investment. The other things then that this generation incorporated frequently were vacancy decontrols. That is the relaxation or the elimination of rent caps when a vacancy occurred. We will talk more about that in the coming weeks. This generation of rent controls would specify that there be a rent board put in place. Sometimes it specified what the composition of that rent board would be. So many renters, so many property owners, et cetera. That kind of guideline as well. And then finally, this generation of rent control also incorporated other kind of complementary types of provisions related to controlling conversions to condominiums, or incorporating eviction protections for tenants as well. So these are the features of the second generation of rent control that differentiated it from that first generation. And I think that we will go into some deep detail on all of these in the coming weeks. So by the early 1980s, it was estimated that close to 10% of all privately owned residential units in the United States were subject to some form of rent regulation. But again, most of this was occurring in California, New York, New Jersey, and I've forgotten the fourth, Massachusetts. Well, right, and in Massachusetts. But what we see in the 1980s and into the 1990s is a swing of the political pendulum back to a position that is not as supportive of rent stabilization. So where more than 170 communities had rent stabilization in the early 1980s, we see the beginnings of a backlash in the 1990s. And the number of cities with rent control begins to decline. Cities in California and Massachusetts eliminate their programs. And in 1994, the Small Property Owners Association of Cambridge, Massachusetts, was successfully able to get a statewide ballot initiative before voters, and that was passed by a 51-49 margin, which eliminated rent control throughout the entire state of Massachusetts. In California in 1995, the state legislature passed the Costa-Hawkins Act, which required vacancy decontrols. It limited rent stabilization to buildings built prior to 1995. and it prohibited rent stabilization on single-family homes. So it created some very specific constraints and limits to rent stabilization in the state of California. And then during this time, and I've seen a comment related to this in the chat, several states moved to preempt local rent control laws. That is, the state legislature essentially stating that local governments shall not have the power to grant or to enact any kind of local laws. Cecile, question.
Is there any research, has Cura done any research as to why the pendulum swung back? For example, was it just, a political move, or were the rent control policies and processes in place proving to have unintended consequences that proved problematic? Just wondering what the why was for the big shift.
Right. I think that it's really a political swing, right? The 1980s is the election of Reagan. It's a movement to a more conservative political environment, and basically you saw a political swing back. I don't think that many of the studies that we're going to be looking at on the impacts of rent stabilization were informing that effort at that point.
Okay, thanks.
Sure, but we'll get more into that as we go along. So the last point, several states preempt local rent control laws. In fact, this is the current situation in the United States. We have rent control in some form or another in these states in the first column here, 6 states plus the District of Columbia. There are asterisks next to Minnesota and Oregon, because both of these states also appear in the second category here, because those states do preempt local rent control. In Oregon's case, the state doesn't allow local governments to do it, but they have created a statewide program. And in Minnesota's case, the preemption allows for voters locally to vote on whether they want rent stabilization. And in fact, last November, both the voters of Minneapolis and St. Paul voted in the affirmative. So while the state preempts it, we do have rent control in those 2 states, as well as these other locations. The big group in the middle, these 32 states, actually prevent rent control through a preemption. There are 7 other states, which we call Dillon Rule states, which restrict the prerogatives of local governments to only those powers expressly given to them by the states. And these states listed have not done that. And then finally, there are 7 other states which don't preempt it, but also don't have any current rent control. Malik, you have a question.
And I don't know if we'll cover it at a later point. I was curious to know, as far as the data goes, if it shows that more rental units have been added to the market, or if they've been taken away from the market with the rent controls in place.
Yeah, we will get to that. There's going to be a whole session on its impact on new construction. And I think, and so we'll be looking at that.
Quick clarification point. I'd be more interested to know outside of new construction, because new construction is kind of is flawed in the data, because new construction is always going to get built. So if you put 1,000 new construction units and you say you added 1,000 units to the city, it doesn't offset the small property owners that have already sold. So you might not show that you lost housing because you've added 1,000 units, but you had 600 single family owners that sold their property. So it's going to show a net increase, but it's actually a decrease.
Okay, right. And we will also talk about the tendency for units to be taken out of the market as well. So I hope that we cover that comprehensively in the way that you've described. but that's on our agenda. All right, so this brings us then to the contemporary period, which many people talk about as being the third wave of rent control. And this is really beginning in this post-housing crisis period. So from a 2011 or 2012 on, again, we see a renewal of interest in rent control. And it spreads to other jurisdictions. More communities in California have adopted rent stabilization. The state of Oregon passed its statewide law in 2019. Some places that already had rent control strengthened their rent control. So most notably in New York, the state of New York adopted some revisions in 2019, where after years of weakening their law, actually began to strengthen it and make it stricter than it had been before. They eliminated deregulation, they eliminated vacancy decontrol, they eliminated various other elements that some might regard as favorable to property owners, and they imposed new restrictions on that. And then, of course, we know that St. Paul, during this third wave of rent control, becomes the only city outside of a coastal state to enact rent control. And it is likely to be followed soon by the city of Minneapolis. Or at least we know that there are discussions taking place on this. And so I want to briefly summarize this brief history by talking about a couple of different themes. First of all, reminding you that the form of rent control has evolved over time, and ideas about how it should be applied have changed from rigid price freezes to what now is a pretty complex and flexible set of regulations that really pertain to several different elements of the housing market. I think it's also worth noting that there has been a political ebb and flow to the history of rent control in the United States. There are periods where it is popular, there are periods where it is less popular, and I think that is reflected in where it appears and where it disappears. And then finally, although I haven't mentioned this too much yet, this is another topic that we will talk about, which is that rent control, even if it remains in a city over a longer period of time, tends not to be static. Most cities tend to tinker with their rent stabilization program by adding a feature, by revising a feature here, by changing, et cetera. I think I think probably the most dramatic form of this is maybe repealing an act altogether. But short of that, sometimes cities will change the details. They will change the amount of their rent cap. They will change features of the vacancy decontrol, et cetera. It's not a static phenomenon in any case. And so we're going to be talking a great deal more about that. I think what I would like to do right now, we're 16 minutes after, is to break you up into small discussion groups and allow you to sort of react with each other about this history, to talk about it, to ask questions, or to give your reactions to a small group, and to think about maybe what are the takeaways from this brief history for you. So if we could do that, I guess either Tony or Tripti, you are putting us into rooms, and we can stay there for 5 or 10 minutes while you have an opportunity to talk with each other about this. Is anything happening?
I'm working on it right now. Troopty put together a list of people in breakout room to put into breakout rooms, but it doesn't seem to be working on my end as created.
Can we just do random breakout rooms?
Yeah, we can do that.
So why don't you just create about 9 or 10 breakout rooms, and there'll be random collections of people.
Okay, I'll work on that as quickly as possible. Again, apologize for the delay.
Okay, that's right. We're 75 minutes into it. We need a break anyway, so.
So yeah, it might make sense to take maybe a 5-minute break. And then Troopsy and I will get this sorted out.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Thanks, Tony. So everyone will be back at 2:23 to see if we can break up then.
Hey, Tony.
We went to a breakout room and then we're back here.
Tony, I think we're taking a quick 5-minute break, and then while the Cura team assigns us to breakout rooms.
Yeah, I apologize. Some people did get placed into rooms, but instead of putting everyone into a room, it just assigned a few. So we'll work on fixing this on our end, and hopefully we can figure that out soon.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got disconnected. Did I miss anything?
Hey,
Yep.
who is this?
Oh, go ahead, Chuti. Like, Chu, sorry. Chu, we're just in a little 5-minute break, and then we'll be going into small groups in just a couple minutes. So folks are all off camera because they're just taking that break, and then we'll be heading into those small groups pretty soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
And then, yeah, I'll just wait till everyone gets back. All right, it is 2:24. This is Trupti back again, and I'm just going to go ahead. Let's see, Ed, should I go ahead and just start open up the rooms, and so people will come as they come back, they'll come into their room?
That's a good
should we
question.
wait?
I think go whatever you think, Phil. Whatever you think.
I was just gonna call on people to indicate if you're back, either by coming on camera or using a reaction or something in the chat. But if folks can come back, and then we can break into the breakout rooms, hopefully.
Great. Thank you, Phil.
You might just want to repeat the instruction just for folks as they're coming back too. So
Yep. So if you're back and we can't see you yet, if you could come on camera or otherwise indicate that you're here, a thumbs up or something like that. Just want to make sure we have kind of critical mass. And then we will break into our breakouts, hopefully. Okay, looks like I think we have enough people back to go ahead, Trupti.
All right. Thank you. Room should be opening up here. Okay, got a couple people here. Robbie, let me see. Let me get you assigned into a room here. Oh. Kyrie and Ian, I see you guys. I'm just trying to figure out how to get you into a breakout room. Okay, there we go.
Sorry about that. I don't know why it wasn't working.
No, I don't. No. I don't know what happened. So, oops. I don't know if that's a result of me creating a room, and then when it flipped to you to do the breakout, if that changed the changed the settings.
Yeah, I wonder.
Okay, so just for next time, just so you know, okay, the pre-assignment did not work well, so I ended up having to like manually assign everybody essentially, even though, so, oh, you know what, we're on the live caption here.
Oh.
So I think I have to give an announcement here. I think to everyone watching the live stream, we are in breakout rooms and doing discussion right now. And so with that, we cannot put you into visibility of the discussion room. So we just have to wait until they come back. We'll probably give them a few more minutes here. They started at 2:25. We'll give them to at least 2:32. So if you are listening to the public streaming event, please return back at 2:32, and we will bring the whole group back into the meeting. Thanks for your patience as we learn the challenges of online meetings here. Just for the live stream, we are just waiting for our participants. They are in breakout rooms. We cannot, due to technical limitations, we cannot share those breakout rooms. We are going to be returning, bringing everyone back in around 2:32. So please return back at that time if you're watching the public live stream.
Welcome back, everybody. If we have everybody back, go ahead, Ed.
Okay, thank you, Philip. I do want to give anyone an opportunity if there was something that came up in your breakout session, is a unusually compelling question or point. If you want to take the opportunity now to tell the rest of us, otherwise I would move on to the second topic for the day. So.
Something that came up, or a question that I had in our group, was something that I don't know why I hadn't thought about it before, and I think would be really helpful to know for the group, which, I don't know, what percentage of us stakeholders live in St. Paul. I think that would be really interesting to know and helpful.
All right, we can put that on the post-meeting survey so that everybody gets to answer that. I see a couple of other hands. Malik, yours.
I think one of the, just talking about the label of property owner and everything being lumped into one. Some people use it as a main source of income. Other people as multifamily units. But just it seems like all landlords or property owners are lumped into one category outside of new construction.
All right. Thanks. Tony?
You know, our group really looked at it as a lot of this in history was around these really traumatic times where you know, things were pushed to the limit and around a lot of trauma in the country. And then there was a general conversation just about that, you know, everybody is really looking for a win-win situation. And no matter what side of the fence that they think they sit on, really looking for a solution that benefits and supports everybody. And they want to make sure that people can afford to live, and they also want people to be able to want to invest to and be prosperous. So
great, thanks, Tony. Cecile.
think it's something that Malik had said earlier, which was that it was really interesting to hear the presentation, and we had some of the same comments that have been said, but that ultimately what would be most helpful is to really understand like the so what. So what happened as a result of all those policies during different times, and if the intended outcome was achieved, and what the unintended consequences were, and what the impacts were that they had hoped would happen.
Yep, and that's where we're heading next. Just wanted to get the historical perspective and context behind. Trom, you're next.
Thank you. Something that I've just been thinking about recently is how we sometimes lump renters into one big group as well. And I think there's a lot of diversity in renters. There are, people who are renting as students. There are people who are lifelong renters. There are people who are renting in public housing. So I think, there's a diversity in every group of stakeholders. Okay,
thank you, Trom. Kyrie.
I think that one thing that stood out for our group was the cyclical nature of our responses in this arena. That we're often responding to emergency circumstances with something that can take on different facets, but generally has the same characteristics. And then there can also be the same cyclical pushback. So how there's the phrase, there's really nothing new under the sun. So.
Great, thank you. Jay.
Our group talked a little bit about in those cities that enacted rent control, or in fact still have them, it doesn't seem to have economically damaged the cities. In other words, they're continuing vibrant cities. But what was missing, and I know we're going to get into, is how did it affect the different groups? How did it affect big developers versus a small mom and pop landlord? But on whole, it didn't seem to stifle housing. Now, yeah, you could argue there's not enough housing in any city, but that could be false for some reasons. But how did it break down by size of landlord, big developer versus mom and pop? But again, overall, it didn't seem to impact the economic vitality of the various cities.
Great, thank you, Jay. Abdi Aziz.
Yeah, one thing that I actually didn't get a chance to bring it up is the fact that this has been in existence for more than 100 years. So there's a lot to learn. 1920, 2022. So just there's a lot of maybe good things to learn about where it has actually worked and where it hasn't.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think with that, that's what we'll move to next. We've got about 20 minutes left, and let's see how far we get on the topic. So having the sort of the quick history behind us, what we're going to be doing over the next several weeks is looking at these policy choices that face every city that is enacting rent stabilization, and we're going to go over each of these categories in their own turn. Today, we're focusing the rest of our time on this first issue, which is the choice of a cap. So if rent stabilization is about capping rents, what are the considerations here? What has been the experience of cities, and what, in fact, do we know about the impact? And so the cap, the purpose of the cap, of course, is to control the rate at which rents increase, right? In some cases, caps are put in place to eliminate the very largest rent increases, what some people call rent gouging. In other places, it's really to protect and to produce stability in the housing market, and to sometimes provide some predictability for tenants in their housing costs. And in fact, we know that in this respect, the research is pretty consistent that rent caps do in fact achieve their main objective, which is that over time, rent control programs do really reduce the rents in controlled units. This may sound like it's true by definition, but we will talk about some situations in which caps may not actually achieve this. But overall, rent control programs reduce rents for the families that they target, and this is a consistent finding in the literature. The impact isn't always immediate, right? Because there's always a baseline period for the imposition of rent caps, and the 10-year, what economists like to call the 10-year discounts, which is the difference between a market rate rent and a controlled rent. This grows over time, right? And but the research does show that that these differences do become significant over time. I mentioned earlier that the state of Massachusetts ended rent control in 1995. This gave researchers a very unique opportunity to study what would happen to the market with the elimination of controls. And they found, in fact, in a study of Cambridge, Massachusetts, very substantial rent increases immediately after the end of the program. And the rent increases were the greatest in neighborhoods that had the most rent-controlled units beforehand. And what they estimated from their study was that controlled units and the residents who lived there were actually paying rents that were at a level about 40% below the price of nearby uncontrolled units. Now, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the rent control had been in place over 25 years. And so what they found is that after 25 years, those tenants who were in controlled units were paying about 40% less. So they were seeing a substantial impact of the program over time. And other studies of New Jersey and California also found the same patterns where rent regulations and cities with rent regulations had lower growth rates in rents than cities that did not have it. I will say that you should note that property owners or multifamily property owners tend to provide a 10-year discount sometimes even without rent control. That is to say, the longer a tenant lives in a unit, the more likely that tenant is to be paying less than the market or less than what a new tenant would pay, right? I mean, I think that is considered by some to be standard behavior on the part of managers, favoring existing tenants. The research here shows that the 10-year discounts from rent control are, of course, greater than that. So that taking into account that a 10-year discount actually is operating procedure for many operators, rent control provides a discount that's above and beyond that. And what you see in front of you is figures from a study of Los Angeles in the early 1980s. And the first category here is the rent discount in non-controlled units. These were one-bedroom units. These are the figures I'm giving you right here. Tenants that had been staying there for 5 to 10 years were paying roughly about 16% less than what was going on the market at that time. So this is that long-term 10-year discount. This study found that for renters who had been there for more than 10 years, the discount was about 28%. But in the same city, they looked at what the 10-year discounts were when there was rent control for rent-controlled units. And they found that it was significantly higher in both places. So this is just an illustration of the impact of those benefits. All long-term tenants get a benefit. But tenants in rent controlled units who stay there a long time get, of course, the largest benefits.
Ed, I don't know if you're able to keep up with this, but there's a number of questions and comments coming in the chat. I know it's a large group, so leave it to you to decide how to manage that. But there are.
Yeah, you're right. I had my chat off for a second. Let's see. Are these studies available for review? We can load them and put them up in our office in our shared space. So yes, we can do that. Is there data shows the average rent amounts as a proportion of tenants' income? Not that I know of, Thomas. I don't know of a study that looks at it that way. It's hard enough for researchers to get the rent information, but to get the income information for those same units, I don't know of a study like that. And then in Cambridge, did the same tenant remain? Right. I think that Cambridge during those years had vacancy control, so so the rents were not going up during that period to market rates. And then Cecile, isn't the discount higher in rent control because landlords were limited? Exactly. That's exactly right. It's just pointing out that that limit works. Catherine, the question about quality, we will get to. There's mixed evidence on that, but we're going to dive deeply into that question in the future. Same with rates of new development. Those are topics that we're going to get into deeply in the future. Right now, I still want to continue with these with the material on rent caps and get through that. And yes, Richard, we can make that information available to you. What I have done, by the way, one of my principles for moving forward and providing you with evidence from studies is to focus only on studies that have empirically studied these questions rather than theoretical arguments or applications of theoretical economic models. I'll be reporting to you the findings from studies of actual programs as they have operated. And by empirical, I mean just studies of what actually happened. All right. So this is just, a couple of slides to show that the rent controls work. They do have the intended outcomes. And so there's this reducing rents, the 10-year discounts, the elimination of rent gouging. The other set of impacts has to do with residential stability. There's a real unanimity in the research that indicates that tenants who live in rent-regulated units stay in those units longer. That it does increase stability, residential stability. It keeps folks in their units longer. Now, economists don't necessarily think this is a good thing all the time. Economists, you can see that they write sometimes about what they call an inefficient allocation of units. And this is their way of saying that sometimes economists think people stay in units that they otherwise should leave. Perhaps they've gotten a new job somewhere else and it's further away from their unit, but they don't leave the unit because it is rent regulated. Or their family is growing and it's now become more crowded, but they don't leave because the rent is regulated. So economists look at residential stability and they see potential inefficient allocation of units. However, there's a lot of research that points to the benefits of residential stability. Greater stability in your housing provides health benefits, both physical and mental health. It increases stability in employment. It's been shown to have an impact on the educational performance of children. It has an effect on people's sense of belonging in their community, the development of their social support networks. And there are benefits at the community level too for the development of social cohesion. But one recent study of San Francisco showed that rent control increases the stability by about 20%. A larger share of those still in their neighborhoods would otherwise have moved out of San Francisco, which is a city that's experiencing significantly increasing rents. This study also showed that these stability effects were stronger for older households and for longer term residents, and also stronger for BIPOC tenants, so that the impact on that change is greater among that group of residents. And this is consistent across research findings. These are a study of San Francisco, but basically any study of rent stabilization that you look at will point to the same set of findings. And Jay, to your question in the chat, that's data that we are in the process of collecting and hopefully getting that before you in the next couple of weeks. Tony's question is, does this promote segregation if people stay put in longer in places that were segregated to begin with? I think that that's not a question that I've seen addressed in the research. There's a certain logic to that if it reduces resident mobility. Let's get to the nuts and bolts of setting a cap. How do we to set rent increases? What are the considerations in place? I think it's important to note that setting the rent increases, setting the cap is a balancing act, right? You want to balance the benefits of having a simple method, yet wanting to account for all of the complexity in the marketplace. There's a certain benefit to having a uniform cap that everyone understands, that applies to all units out of a sense of fairness. Yet, on the other hand, we know that there is significant variation in the housing market and among renters. And then finally, you want a system that is predictable, that investors can make decisions based on, that tenants can make life choices based on, yet you also want to be responsive to events and other conditions that may require a quick responsiveness. So that's important. There are basically 4 different approaches to setting caps that have been used by other cities. The first is to simply leave the decision to a rent board. So the city of New York essentially does this, where the annual determination is made by the rent board, which looks at various data and studies associated with the local market. Another way of going about it is to establish a flat percentage increase, right? This is what the St. Paul Ordinance currently has. And so this is used in a number of different jurisdictions across the country. The third approach is to use a variable rate of change, which is either tied to inflation or some other index of economic performance. It's usually tied to a measure of inflation, and the most common one is the Consumer Price Index. And Bill, yes, there are other cities that use a flat percentage increase. We'll get some more information on that here in a second. And then the last approach, the fourth approach, is a variable rate, but with upper or lower limits. So we have the possibility of a rate that is perhaps tied to inflation, but that doesn't go below a certain percentage or above a certain percentage. So this is the combination of a variable rate with flat percentage limits at the high and the low end. And those are the four most common approaches that you see. And I was going to give a number of historical examples, but we're getting a little close on time. Massachusetts and Maine went for the most responsive kind of fair net operating income approach. They created formulas that where you plugged in data about the building itself. You incorporate data on taxes, on operating expenses, building conditions, and then from that formula comes a specific rent cap. Berkeley had an annual cost study approach where they studied the local market on an annual basis. They found that to be too onerous over time and switched to an inflation-based cap in 2005. And as I mentioned earlier, New York City has their rent guidelines board set the cap annually.
Ed, I hate to interrupt, but I think we should probably wrap the meeting. Just this is a big commitment of time that everybody's putting in, and I'm sure I'm not alone in wanting to hear more of where you're going with this, but want to honor everybody's time with a 3 o'clock stop. There was one other question I saw come in the chat. I don't know if you want to try to address that one, Ed, before we close.
Right. Others, any research to see property tax revenue loss or gain because of the rent cap? I have not seen a study that looks at that question. But as is pointed out, that's an interesting question. And then Kelly, it'd be helpful to understand the correlation between the number of units and tenant stability. I'm not sure I understand that question, but Kelly, we can talk offline on this, and I can.
Well, it's great to see so many of the questions that have come in are things that are slated out in the upcoming sessions that we're going to be getting data and studies on and be able to look at the sources on those. So hate to cut it off in the middle of a topic, but we will pick up with this when we meet again next week. And I just really appreciate everybody's time and engagement as we embark on this policy journey together. Hope you have a good week.
And we're going to post all the slides, right, Ed? Okay. Yeah, I'm sure she's gone already, but we'll make sure those posts and we'll send them out too.
Yes, we are. Right.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Ed.